Good evening, everyone. I'm Lisa DeSisto, the CEO and publisher of the Portland Press Herald. The information on the fall sports season is rapidly changing. Just got some information late this afternoon that our panelists will share. And we couldn't bring you a more in the know, up to the minute panel for this discussion. First, I want to thank you all for being subscribers to the Portland Press Herald. And while it's an unsettling time for all of us, I hope our coverage of the coronavirus has kept you informed over these last many months. And I hope tonight you're safe and healthy on this beautiful evening in Maine. And now to introduce you to tonight's host and guests. Don Coulter will be leading the discussion. He's the sports editor at the Press Herald Maine Sunday Telegram, and he's been with us for much of the past 2 decades. He oversees our team of reporters and editors who cover high school sports, our minor league teams, and professional sports. And while he and his team love tourney time, like all of you and I, they really thrive producing exclusive enterprise features that you'll find on page 1 of the Maine Sunday Telegram. Like, should high school coaches be paid stipends for a spring season that was never played? Very popular, comments very provocative. And a piece earlier this summer about what high school sports could look like in Maine based on how other states are handling it. Don will be joined by sports writers Mike Lowe and Steve Craig, who have been following the impact COVID-19 has had on high school sports and athletes since the season came to an abrupt halt in March. Now, when we were in full sports shutdown, both high school and professional, both Mike and Steve were called on to produce features we called Maine Acts of Kindness. They told heartwarming human stories that were a welcome break from the daily coronavirus counts. Their talent and versatilities as storytellers was evident in these features. I hope you had a chance to read some of them. One of my favorites was Mike's story on how a Dayton, Maine first grade class found a pen pal in 92-year-old Vincent Nuccio, who made videos for the kids instructing them in math and teaching them how to count with currency. And I think Strawberry's going to pop the link to that in the chat if you didn't get to read it. We're so fortunate Mike's been writing stories for the Press Herald since 1982. His grand dog Mookie often makes Mike's Twitter feed, so if you don't follow Mike on Twitter, you should. I do miss being in the office because every few weeks Mike would wander down to my desk and we'd talk sports. From the Patriots to my Greeley Rangers, I sure do miss Mike. Steve Craig also has a long history with Maine newspapers. His first newspaper job was covering Maine high school sports in 1986, working out of a tiny office at the front of a hand-sewn shoe shop in Skowhegan. After 12 years as a sports writer in New Hampshire, he wrote 2 books, had a multi-year stint as a Press Herald freelance motorsports columnist, and even taught 5th grade. In 2012, we were happy to have Steve join the Press Herald staff full-time. Please welcome Don Coulter, Mike Lowe, and Steve Craig. And thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you to all our subscribers who are here tonight, and most of all for subscribing to the Press Herald to produce the kind of stories that Lisa just talked about. So we picked the date for this seminar probably a good month or so ago, and it turned out to be fortuitous. There's a lot going on. I figured going into this that Mike and Steve and I would have no problems talking about high school sports. We could probably talk about it for 2 hours because that's what we've been talking about all summer among us and in the reporting that we're doing, whether or not sports can resume again safely. But nonetheless, this morning, I took some time to jot down on a legal pad various questions just to make sure that we had some direction for the show tonight. Mike and Steve and I later discussed this earlier this afternoon, and then, whoops, everything changes this afternoon. So Mike Lowe, the man in the Hawaiian shirt, why don't you update us with the breaking news from this afternoon regarding the Maine high school football fall season?
Well, just before the 2 o'clock press conference today that the CDC holds, the Department of Education and along with the GHHS sent out the release saying that essentially they've told the Maine Principals Association that they should go back and revisit some of their guidelines that they just presented to them last week for the fall sports season. Some of these guidelines they felt didn't quite adhere to state guidelines, and they need some more work. Among them, the state feels the mask should be worn by athletes. Social distancing needed to be more stringently enforced among spectators, of which I would assume there are going to be very few at any of these games, if they have any of the games. Essentially the risk factor that the state places on the sports as opposed to what the MPA placed on them. So essentially they told the MPA, you have to stop what you're doing, go back, fix these guidelines, and we'll revisit that when you come back to us. They've essentially told the MPA to put the fall sports season on hold once again. And frankly, we don't know when it will start, if it will start. I think we have a good idea that there are going to be some sports that are not going to be played in the fall, including football, unless something miraculous changes in the next 10 days. I don't think you'll see high school football games in the fall. Steve, you agree with that?
Unfortunately, I do, Mike. That's one of the things that I learned today from talking to a couple of football coaches. What they're frustrated with is they don't even know how they could get to the next stage with their sport to be able to be considered eligible to play actual games. Right now, they'd be cleared if these guidelines that came out today were to hold, they'd be cleared to practice and have an inter-squad scrimmage with a limited number of players. But they really don't know. I mean, what do we have to prove? With what one of the coaches said, do the caseloads need to be X amount? Do we have to have no outbreaks until certain date? They'd like to have something defined like that so they could at least have a target to shoot for. But unfortunately, and I really enjoy covering high school football, I don't think it's going to happen.
I think one of the things
not this fall anyway.
Right. I think one of the things that concerns people when it comes to high school football, and I'm going to be honest with you, when the Maine Principals Association last week announced that they were moving forward with all sports, I was quite surprised that football got the green light. Or I later learned that it was actually a blinking yellow light from Dr. Bill Hines, the medical director of the MPA, in which case they were going to watch what happens not only in Maine, but across the country. And if there was some sort of outbreak among football teams across the country, they would shut down football here. But I was still surprised they had that go because of just all the messages I had heard all summer long about how tough it would be to play high school football. Listen, it's a very, it's a high contact sport. On every play, there's at least 10 players on each team who are making contact with a player on the other team. The exception is a quarterback and maybe one defensive player who's kind of like the last line of defense back in the secondary. People are hitting each other. They're sweating. It's just a collision on every play. And I thought there's no way they could play. But then when I talked to Dr. Hines and his rationale for allowing football, I could see where they came from. Listen, there's been a lot of games played across the country already. 7 states have been playing high school football. This is the 3rd week in Utah. There's a 2nd week in a lot of other states. That meant each of those states also had probably 3 weeks of preseason. So there's been a lot of football being played in other parts of the country, and there had been very few outbreaks or incidences of COVID-19 positive tests among football players. That's changed in the past week. There's been a couple of more teams, but still the percentage is very low. And I could see, okay, give them a chance. The MPA did not want to say we can't play. Let's at least start and see what happens. But under these new guidelines by the state, I just it's not possible. Like you said, Steve, they can practice and they can have inter-squad scrimmages, but they're not going to play games.
Yeah, and just to backtrack a little bit for the sake of our viewers, 2 weeks ago, the Maine Principals Association reached out to the state and said it wanted some clear guidelines in terms of being able to start up high school sports. There was a set of guidelines out there from the Department of Education in regards to gym classes, PE classes in schools. And then there was a second set of guidelines called the Community Sports Guidelines. And that's what youth sports and club teams have been using this summer as they got started up in June. The states, at the request of the MPA, said, look, we'd like you to follow the community sports guidelines. And at that time, the guidelines had risk factors for various sports. The high-risk sports under that were football and soccer. Other sports were either categorized as medium risk or low risk. I think the low risk sports were golf and cross country, if I recall correctly. But so the MPA took that into consideration when its sports medicine committee made the suggestions on sports to move forward. But as Mike said, it was, I think, to not only to us in this chat room, but to most observers around the state who follow high school sports, it was pretty surprising that they decided to give the green light to football. Now, today, what has changed, the state, as Mike had mentioned earlier, has revised its community sports guidelines. This is after the MPA made its decision last week in terms of what it hopes for fall sports. Soccer now is a medium risk classification. And so with that, presumably soccer games could be played by high school teams in the state. As Mike mentioned, football remains a high risk sport, meaning that games cannot be played. They can play intra-squad games. And one change today too regards the sport of volleyball. So volleyball is the only sport in Maine that's played during the fall indoors. Volleyball is considered a medium risk sport, but under the guidelines from the community sports directive, the games could not be played indoors. They would have to be played outdoors. So that's a big change that could affect that sport. So it looks perilous, frankly, for football being played this fall and for volleyball. Mike, Steve, any thoughts about volleyball? Or Steve, I know you spoke with a couple of coaches this afternoon.
Yeah, I spoke with a coach who's on the volleyball committee for the MPA, and really they're really hopeful that the MPA will take into account that a best situation for volleyball is to get shifted into the what you could call like late winter, early spring after the basketball season. Gyms are basically open for them at that point, and that's when they'd like to have a season. They don't think playing outdoors, which Vermont has announced that it would do with its volleyball, is really a very viable option. It's possible, but as a different volleyball coach said to me, if you play on grass, kids are going to be slipping all the time. Nobody really has sand courts that they could play on, or at least not enough schools would have that as an option. And then even if you were even if you did have a facility that you could play on, it wouldn't take long before you're challenged with lighting, because how many of those places would be lit? Because they're all temporary. And I think their feeling is that they'd like very much to be able to use the ability to practice indoors, because like football, they're at that level 3 where they can do things indoors as a team and scrimmage and use this as practice time, which they haven't had over the summer, at least in southern Maine, and then just have a different season. But that'll be a pretty significant change, because at this point, the MPA has seemed reticent to switch seasons or create sort of a 4th season as other states have done.
I think that might change, Steve, given what came down today. I think the MPA officials understand that maybe they got to get a little creative like other states and move some seasons around. I don't think you're going to see any of the spring seasons come into the fall. I think it's too late to do that. Like moving baseball or softball to the fall. I think it's too late to do that. But Gary Stevens here just wrote something on the chat, which I was going to bring up. One of the other problems facing volleyball in the fall is also the fact that many gymnasiums are being used as cafeterias or classrooms because of social distancing. So it would be difficult for some schools to even have a gym available for volleyball. So that's another reason for them to consider moving it to the spring. And I know when I talked to a couple of volleyball coaches earlier this summer, they were hoping, like you said, that would be the decision that the MPA would make. It just seems a smart one to do. Football, on the other hand, I don't know It's an outdoor sport. Spring in Maine is not real nice usually. There's usually a lot of snow on the ground or a lot of mud on the ground. So it presents its own issues. I'm sure that they could play football in the spring here if they needed to. But we'd have to see. You've got a lot of turf fields in southern Maine. So you could maybe have multiple games at a site on a Friday or a Saturday. And most teams could get in games, but the northern Maine, there is a lack of turf fields as opposed to the south. So I know you've got Hamden Academy, you've got Messalonskee. I can't think of any other high schools with turf up that way. Oceanside maybe. But anyway, it would be difficult. No, it's Lincoln Academy. I'm sorry, has it. It would be difficult, I think, to have all the teams in the state play in the spring. So things to consider. Football is, again, it's in a tough spot.
So before the NPA made its decisions last week, and its interscholastic management committee approved the recommendations from the sports medicine committee to have all sports played, there was a movement for a good week or so, a Let Us Play movement. There was a Facebook page that started up. Within days, it ballooned to 2,000 followers and 5,000 and maybe 8,000 followers. In Augusta, a couple rallies were held with high school students, high school athletes, also parents out there saying that we deserve to play. And one of the arguments was that, hey, look, so far this summer, there have been club sports playing. Baseball, softball teams have been playing. Kids have been playing basketball inside. All appears to be fine. There isn't a breakout. There haven't been breakouts from this. And even though certainly the coronavirus outbreak poses a public health risk for everybody, and that COVID-19 can be passed on obviously from one person to another, including those who are showing no symptoms and could affect others in the community. The argument for Let Us Play is that, hey, kids typically don't get gravely ill, even if they contract the disease. What do you guys, what is your take about that, about the Let Us Play movement and the arguments that we've been doing it all summer, why shouldn't we have sports this fall?
I'll jump in on that. I think there's validity to it, frankly. I mean, there haven't been significant outbreaks. And I will say that my opinions seem to vary with every day or hour of whatever you're reading or hearing. But, Maine's numbers have been low. Let's be honest. Maine has done a tremendous job relative to other states controlling this. And I saw in one of our Q&As that came in, somebody made a mention, they're playing football in Alabama. Why can't we play it in Maine? Or they're going to do it in New Hampshire. Why can't we do it in Maine? So there's a part of me that says if there is any state in the union that really should be going forward with fall sports or sports in general, it should be Maine. I think there's also a strong push that from the educators and the coaches that we're better equipped to monitor, regulate, mitigate, and control the environment than a lot of club sports, which were able to go throughout the summer without at least any reported outbreaks here in Maine. A scattering across New England have shown up. I think there's validity to it. The bigger concern, and I know Don, Mike, and I have talked about this quite a bit, is what might be the long-term effect for a younger athlete who does contract COVID-19. Specifically myocarditis, potential risk of heart inflammation, other issues that would also then likely be undetected because you wouldn't have the testing opportunities. It would be incumbent upon the parent to go that extra step to say, ooh, Jimmy or Susie did test positive for COVID-19. They're not really very sick. They could probably go back to play. What else might have happened? Internally.
I agree with you, Steve. I think, I'd like to see them play. I mean, there's no question. I mean, this is what we do, isn't it?
Right.
I mean, we watch them play and we report on it, and we you know, this is what we do. But I also think there are things that are unknown, as you said, about this disease. It's, you know, scarring on lungs. It's the myocarditis. It's all those things that we're just learning about, that's happening to these young people, and it's happening to professional athletes as well. I mean, let's face it, there's so much unknown, and I think that's where state officials are saying, look, we really need to be careful going forward. And it's not just them. You talk to the school superintendents, and there are great fears from them about, you know, the potential exposure to the disease by having a team go play in another town or something, you know, and you know, there's just I don't know how to describe it except that the great unknown. They don't want to find out what that is.
Yeah, you know, and that just reminds me of, this was weeks ago. I don't even know what story we were working on. I called an epidemiologist who lives in Yarmouth, and he said something that's really stuck with me. He said, I totally understand the desire for both kids and parents to want to play sports and the value in sports and the benefits of social and emotional benefits that are gained through sports. But that desire does not change if there is still a risk of infection. No matter how much you desire something, it doesn't change this other factor. So, you know, fortunately, there haven't been a lot of outbreaks, which certainly would speak to maybe we can get through this with very little risk, very little worry. But it doesn't change that the outbreak, you know, the chance of an outbreak is there. And, you know, and let's be honest, this wedding situation in Millinocket, you know, does not help high school sports in the least. When one wedding with maybe 65 reported people actually attending is now being seen as contributing to what was the latest 135 cases in the state. It does show how one incident can lead to something much greater.
And I do want to point out that, you know, having worked on so many of these stories in the last 10 days, the MPA's sports medicine committee really, and the individual sports committees for each fall sport really did what they were asked to do by the state. The state asked them to come up with guidelines to make their sports safer, and they did. You know, there have been, like soccer, for instance, they came up with eliminating the slide tackle within 6 feet of another player. They came up with reducing the number of players in the box on corner kicks and throw-ins. They get rid of the drop ball on you know, on a dead ball. You know, they came up with those items. Volleyball players were going to have to wear masks. You know, cross country, the courses are going to be widened. They're going to have staggered starts. You know, it's you know, so they did, you know, they did the best they could, given the information they had. And I really think that what has happened is that the guidelines changed a little bit from the state with the new community sports guidelines, and now they're trying to get them all back in line with each other. And that's what the MPA's task is now, to come up with guidelines to play that are more in line with what the state has.
And just so folks know about the Maine Principals Association, sometimes there's some confusion about what sort of agency it is. The MPA is not part of state government. It's a nonprofit corporation, and it's split into two arms. One of the arms, and part of their directive, is to work with principals and other school administrators in terms of issues to do with academics, fostering a network for these administrators to be able to meet with one another and discuss issues that are important to them. And then the other half of it is the half that we report upon all the time, and that has to do with high school sports. They oversee extracurricular activities, including activities like drama, dance, etc. But in terms of high school sports, they work closely with coaches and athletic directors at high schools in terms of trying to educate them on rule changes or safety measures And this is long before the pandemic. That's a very important part of their task. And of course, they also establish the dates for the sports seasons for any given year, fall, winter, spring. They set up the championship events. They set up the protocols that allow for playoffs based on heel points, etc. And the MPA typically has its critics out there, and it catches a lot of grief. And it seemed to catch a lot of grief just 2 or 3 weeks ago, where I think a lot of people on social media assumed that the MPA was going to, was kind of jerking everybody around, and was, when all was said and done, was going to cancel the fall sports season. And yet Mike Burnham, the executive director of the MPA, said, no, all along in reporting that Mike and Steve did, he said, no, our intent here is to try to get all sports played safely, and we'll see if we can do that. Steve, what's your take? Is the MPA getting a bad rap here this summer in general about how they've handled the return to sports?
I think to a degree, yes. I do think all of the state agencies right now have to take some blame that we're still here on September 1st and nothing has really been decided yet. And I don't know whether that's really the MPA's fault or whether that's a lack of communication between the organizations. It does seem like there's certainly been some mixed messages along the way. At one point, Mike got an email response from one of the state agencies that said this is the MPA's decision. That was about mid-August. And then last week, the MPA made a decision, and it certainly feels like, well, that wasn't the decision we wanted the MPA to make. So, and also the MPA sought additional guidance based, what is the feedback that you're going to give us on our decision? Talking to some people today, there was one coach mentioned to me that he did feel like, it kind of feels like, they wanted the MPA to be the bad guy, and then all of a sudden the MPA wasn't going to be the bad guy. So now they're trying to shift it back to make sure the MPA is the bad guy. They being state organizations, which that's probably an unfair portrayal of the state organizations, because I think their first and foremost concern is overall population health and safety. And, the high school sports are only a piece of that whole picture that they're looking at.
Steve, one of the things, and Ron Kramer has mentioned this on the chat. Ron's a soccer official, I believe, Ron. I think that's what you are. He mentioned risk factors for field sports officials. And, these are things that when we talk about the unknown risk, Maine has its officials have an average age of 54 in the fall. And that's close to the high risk category for this disease. And one of the concerns is that, one of the officials, contracts it, or a player brings it home to his family, his parents or his grandparents. So, there's just so much out there. And I think the bottom line is that everybody, the MPA and all the state agencies are trying to come up with a decision that is the safest for everyone involved. To mitigate the chance of any transmission. And it's not easy. As Bill Hines said, the easy decision would have been to say no to all sports because, the disease is out there. It's everywhere. But the hard decision was to come up with safety guidelines to allow them to play. And that's what they're trying to do. And, we are 1 week away from the supposed start of the fall season, which has already been delayed once. I'm not sure when it will start. It's possible that it will be delayed another week, or it's possible that, the MPA will come up with the, recommended changes to its guidelines within a couple of days, and the fall season begins on September 8th as they want. I think the next 48 hours are going to be pretty interesting here.
And then it's going to shift.
We've been saying that for 2 weeks now. Though,
right.
So.
And then at some point, it's going to shift to the local school districts, some of whom have already made a decision. I found out today that Kennebunk last night they approved the MPA version, but of course now that's changed since last night's meeting. So that's another real problem going forward, is that whenever this decision is made by whichever state organization it is, then it's going to fall to the local school districts. And we've both, I think Mike would agree with that, we've gotten some, without a lot of real definitive thing, just sort of a strong sense that there are school districts that will say no to sports entirely. And that's happened over in New Hampshire, which has very similar start dates for everything. They're probably a month or so ahead in terms of this is what we're going to do, and they are going to go forward with football. But there are school districts in New Hampshire that have said we're not going to play football, and there's still several school districts that haven't made a decision on anything yet. So
I will say this though, in talking to superintendents, I think if the MPA's guidelines can become more in line with those from the state, whether it's the Department of Education or the Department of Economic and Community Development, Community Sports Guidelines, I think the superintendents will be much more inclined to let the kids play. One of their concerns for the last, from what I've heard, from what I've been told, is that there were seemingly two sets of rules, one for athletes and one for the kids who were in the classroom until 2:30 in the afternoon. At 2:30 in the afternoon, everybody, until in the classroom, everybody had to wear a mask. Everybody had to be 6 feet apart. In gym class, if you were outside without a mask, you had to be 14 feet apart. And then there were the MPA guidelines for sports, which said the only sport that needs to wear a mask while you're playing is volleyball. But you have to wear it if you're on the sideline. But if you're playing, you don't have to wear a mask. And the guidelines were 3 feet to 6 feet, not 6 feet to 14 feet. So there were concerns that, there were two sets of rules. And now I think if the MPA's guidelines can come more in line with what the state is proposing, I think you're going to see more superintendents inclined to say, okay, we like these rules. They're in line with what we want. Let's go forward to it.
So indeed, everyone here, I think, is everyone in the state, the MPA, the superintendents, all down the line, coaches, they want to do this safely. And having coordinated guidelines are important, but the question is, what's taken so long? As you mentioned, it's September 1st. Steve, you wrote a story yesterday about what is going on in New Hampshire. Could you talk about that a little bit in comparison to what we've seen here in Maine?
Well, in terms of their guidelines that they've set forth, really very similar to what the MPA came out with a week ago, and even before that, in terms of the day that it would start, and official practices would start, and win games would start, and then football would start a week later on September 25th. So there were a lot of similarities. From the couple of people I talked to yesterday, the one real big difference really came from the governor. The governor and his task force in New Hampshire said sports are a go, and their community guidelines right from the start said all sports can be practiced and competed. And that was everything literally on the list of names, from badminton to wrestling, with football and wrestling included, and rugby, all these what would be considered high risk sports. So that gave the state organization in New Hampshire a much clearer jumping off point. They kind of knew what they were going to get from feedback from their state agencies. And therefore they were able to get their message out to school boards more quickly. And while not all have decided, quite a few have, and at least based on yesterday's count, they have 58 high school football programs in the state. Several are co-op like we see here in Maine, but 36 have said we're going forward with it. And it will be different, just like it will be here. Fewer games, regional schedules. They're going to have to do things in cohorts during practices, things like that. The one coach I talked to, he has 115 kids in his program. And he said, instead of carrying 85 on the varsity, we'll have about 54. The varsity and the JV and the freshman teams will not intermingle as they would have in the past. We're not going to use our locker rooms at all. So a lot of the same sort of tactics, if you will, that any state would be operating under, I would guess, and certainly that Maine has proposed. Big difference really just was that they had a more definitive answer from their state government earlier in the process.
And it's not just New Hampshire, Steve. In New Mexico, the governor of New Mexico in early July said, we're not playing football and soccer in the fall.
Right. So it goes both ways. You're right.
The governor in Ohio stepped in 2 weeks ago to say, you know what, we are playing football and soccer and field hockey, and let's get it going. That's why they're playing those sports in that state. Pennsylvania, the governor stepped in, and it's New York. There have been many states where the governor has personally stepped in and said, yes, I think we can play. That hasn't been the case here, but for whatever reason. And now we're in a situation where we're a week away from the supposed start of the season, and we don't know what's going to happen.
And it seems very likely that will be delayed. Once upon a time, the fall sports season was supposed to start with practices in mid-August, and this very week would be the start of games. We would have our first football games coming up on Friday night, right before Labor Day. The MPA, as Mike said, had pushed back the start of practices until next Tuesday, games until September 18th, the first football games until the 25th of September. Football now seems like, well, that season's very much in jeopardy, but today the state did ask the MPA to create a further delay when it comes to the start of fall sports. I think we're going to see that. Another thing that the state mentioned in its letter to the MPA has to do with the wearing of face coverings. So, Mike, as you mentioned, the only sport up until now that was required where players were required to wear a face mask during competition was volleyball. It appears now from my reading of the state's letter that any students who are within 6 feet of each other during competition would be required to wear face masks.
That's the way I read it too. I know, Dr. Hines, you're on the call here. Is that your interpretation as well? If you want to pop in there on the chat, I think they're saying if you're going to play a sport, you need to wear a mask. And I know one of the reasons that the MPA said only volleyball was because the other sports were the players are running more and exerting more energy and breathing harder, and they felt that the mask would inhibit them. So, it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. And according to Dr. Hines, the recommendations are conflicting. So, if he doesn't understand
what's new,
if he doesn't understand what the recommendations are, then I'm sure, we all feel good because we're not quite sure what's going on.
Well,
either, so.
and when I read the new, I think it was the new guidelines, or maybe it was the letter to the MPA from DHHS, but there was the term vigorous exercise, which seemed to exclude masks, that once you had engaged in vigorous exercise. So I know if I'm the MPA, I would want to say, well, you need to define what sports and at what stages of sport are we talking about vigorous exercise? Is it, it would seem like certainly that once you start a cross country race and you're running, it's amazing what these kids can run these days, a sub 17-minute time over a 3.1 mile course. That sounds pretty darn vigorous to me. And same with a kid who's playing, 20-minute stretches of field hockey or soccer. So I'm a little unsure too. When will masks need to be worn? Certainly, it does seem like anytime you're not engaged in an activity, if you're on the sideline, whether you're a coach or a player, you're going to have to be wearing that mask. And maybe there are certain sports, like even golf, which is played the entire summer without anybody being asked to wear a mask while playing. Maybe they're going to have to don a face mask.
We got a question in our Q&A about what prevented these two groups from working together to set the guidelines. According to the MPA officials, they've been working all summer. It's just a matter of, it got to the point where the MPA needed more guidance, and they were, they were close to calling off the season completely in July because they felt that under the guidelines that they thought they had to follow by the Department of Education, they would not be able to offer any sports. And so that's when they sought more guidance, and that's when they were told to take a look at the community sports guidelines. But they have been working, and unfortunately, I think there was maybe a loss of communication somewhere here over exactly what was expected. I'm not sure, but along the way, we're at this point now. That's all I can say.
And to those of us in here in the chat with us tonight, we ask you to, we'll answer your questions, but if you could go into the question and answer format as opposed to the chat format for those, we will be glad to answer your questions. Here's one right here. Do you think this decision was in the best interest of students? Steve Craig, you did a story a few weeks ago, very strong story about concerns on the part of both students and coaches and administrators, and even the MPA spoke eloquently about this, about mental health risks. Could you talk about that?
Well, yeah, it is very real, and I think there's I mean, the whole reason for high school sports to begin with is that there's a general feeling, and I think it's valid, that they help engage students fully in the school. It's going to help them with their academics. It's going to hopefully keep them out of trouble. They're going to be passionate about something, and when that passion is stripped away, especially when there's a feeling of, why can't we play our high school sports? We've played club sports all summer. This doesn't make sense to me. Yeah, the kids read the numbers as well, and maybe aren't as able to think about long-term consequences. So they're thinking, I didn't get sick while I played on my travel baseball team and went down to Massachusetts. Why is it going to be different when I only have to go across town to play, somebody? So I think the social and emotional factor is a very big issue for high school students. But I don't want to. But what the original question was, I should probably be looking at the question. It was I feel like I didn't really answer the question, though. So I apologize for that.
That's because I spun it a different way. But
yeah.
But is it made in? I think every decision that they're trying to make is in the best interest of the kids.
Right. Thank you. I really do. I would agree with that too. It's just, and they have to look at not just the kid who's playing the sport. They being superintendents and state administrators and even the MPA should be looking at, what about the kid who sits next to the kid who plays high school sports in the class, if they are going back to school at all, or the grandparent who may come over for Sunday dinner, or the parent, and as a husband of an educator, I know she's very concerned about risk factors for herself, similar to our official Ron Kramer, that if she's in a classroom for 6-7 hours a day with a bunch of fifth graders, what risk is she putting herself in?
And I would like to say something about the guidelines that the MPA has come up with, and Dr. Hines just mentioned this. They were working with two sets of guidelines: the community sports guidelines and the National Federation of State High School Association guidelines, trying to come up with a balance between the two, because there were differences in some of them. Originally, soccer was a high-risk sport in the state guidelines. It was a moderate-risk sport in the National Federation guidelines. So they worked within those two guidelines. And I will say this, that I talked to one superintendent today, and he said that was a problem for them, that they didn't feel that National Federation guidelines should have been used at all. It should have been just the state guidelines. To which my reply was, well, the MPA is a member of the National Federation and ought to be able to use its safety guidelines when it's governing its high school sports. And so there's a lot of these why are they using this? Why are they doing that? Questions that were asked, and I do think that perhaps in the next couple of days, all these questions will be answered, and all these guidelines will be merged together to find a definitive set that can be used to move the fall sports forward.
And one thing we're maybe forgetting is that as of now, if say the current community sports guidelines are essentially accepted en masse by the NPA, several sports will be able to play. We will have soccer, we will have field hockey, we will have cross country, we will have golf. Volleyball hopefully gets to go to a different season, and you're left with one sport, which I think everybody has known from the get-go was the highest risk, probably the most difficult to pull off, maybe the casualty. But the one kind of rub of all of that is that if we had gotten to this decision a little bit quicker, I was talking with a coach today, and I used an example of a specific player at Kennebunk High who was just a tremendous athlete. He's no longer there. If he was still on that team, he could shift to soccer if he knew his football season wasn't going to happen, and he'd be able to be probably, if not a starter, at least a contributor. That's going to be much harder if these decisions are delayed. Even now, they would be really difficult. But, especially if the decision is made even later, that kid might just say, what's it worth to me to do this?
Another thing that came out today from the updated community sports guidelines from the state is that it looks like state championships and regional championships would be prohibitive for medium and high risk sports. And most sports, with the exception of golf and cross country, fall into the medium risk range for fall sports. Football, of course, is a high risk sport. But it appears from the updated guidelines that we're just not going to have regional or state championships. Mike, what will the schedules look like this fall in terms of the number of games played, and will teams be playing in their traditional leagues? Will there be more crossover games? What can fans expect this fall from that? Or I suppose even this winter?
Well, I talked to, originally when the NPA delayed the start of the season to September 8th, they were talking about a 10-game season for soccer and field hockey and other sports and volleyball. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it'll be 6 to 8 games. But now with if there are no playoffs, maybe they just play, longer, get more games in that way. They don't have to worry about playoffs in the season starting. So it's going to be a regional schedule. You're going to be playing the schools that are closest to you. Like, for instance, Thornton Academy will likely play Biddeford again in all sports, although now there's not going to play football. So that takes a little bit of excitement out of that. But boy, I'll tell you, I covered some of those games back in the 80s where they had 10,000 people at those games.
Not going to have 10,000 people either.
No, they're not going to have 10,000 people there. No. You're not going to have any fans at games, I'll tell you that. But I think, all right, Kennebunk's going to play Wells again, which is was once their big rival. They're going to play Biddeford. They're going to play probably Thornton and maybe Sanford. York is going to play Marshwood again, which was once one of the big rivalries down in Southern York County. The Portland area schools are going to play all each other. It's Portland, Deering, South Portland, Westbrook, Cheverus will probably be a part of 5 schools. You throw in maybe Scarborough there. They'll play each other. So the schools, the one of the reasons for the regional schedule is that to limit the amount of time students are on a bus, because we don't know. Athletic directors still don't know how many athletes are going to be allowed on a bus. First off, I know when I talk to college coaches. In the spring, they were told maybe 13 to 14 people on a bus. One high school athletic director told me last week that he thought he was told maybe 20 kids on a bus, 22 kids on a bus. So, they got to figure that out. So the less time kids are on the bus, the better it is to mitigate transmission of any virus. It will be. Gordy Sauls at Sanford said that most likely it'll be a shuttle system for the games, where the bus will take a JV team to a game, and then they'll come back and pick up the varsity team, bring the varsity team to the game, pick up the JV team, bring it back, and then go back to get the varsity team. And each time cleaning the bus before the next team gets on it. So there's a lot to consider. But it looks like, maybe they will get a 10-game season. And if they don't have the playoffs, if they have playoffs of some sort, I think it would probably be a 6 to 8 game season.
Here's another question from a person in our chat room tonight. To avoid this delay again for next season, when do they need to start talking about winter sports?
Well, let's get through the fall first, but I would say as soon as the guidelines are established for the fall sports, they got to move to the winter sports, because under the community sports guidelines, there will be no high school basketball season played in Maine this winter. Basketball is a moderate risk sport, and you cannot play games indoors, much like volleyball. So there'll be no ice hockey season either. So they're going to have to come up. They're going to have to start thinking about what they're going to do there.
It looks like winter. I was just going to say, Don, really, it looks like winter sports are going to be even more of a problem. And that's one of those arguments that you hear, is that if we can't even get a fall sports season started, how can we even, then we're going to lose winters for sure. The kind of the defeatist mentality. I'm not sure that's a valid argument necessarily, because we don't know what the situation is in the state. Post-tourism season, maybe things actually get even better. But and then we've got the issue with a lot of these colleges have said you're not going to be able to use our facilities. So that's going to impact even sports that you'd think might be able to be played, like in track and field indoors, or swimming. And then ice hockey, boy, that's ice hockey and wrestling. If we think football has problems.
Competitive cheering. It's a high risk sport according to the all guidelines. So there's going to be a lot of consideration with the winter sports. Again, facilities are a big issue. I know Bowdoin has already told the high school hockey teams that use its arena that it will not be available. So there are only so many hockey rinks in the state, so hockey's in trouble. I don't know what else can be said.
Mike, speaking of facilities, what's the deal with high school locker rooms? Are those going to be used by teams?
Well, it's believed to be, it'll be a local decision, but most ADs that I've talked to have said that they will not be using the locker rooms. Rich Buzzell actually down in Marshwood said his kids are being told to take their equipment home at night with them rather than store it in the locker room. I think a couple of the ADs said it'll be up to the teams. Kennebunk, they may be using the locker room for the home team, but not the visiting team. It's just, it's unlikely that they're going to be used. Let me put it that way, but it's not definitive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Here's a question from somebody in our audience. Will administrators have options to start some sports, such as golf, earlier than other sports this fall?
No. Well, once the MPA sets the date for first countable games, that's when you start playing those games.
Although, and who knows what's going to happen now, but there is that idea that if there were playoffs, they could possibly be open tournaments, sort of looking ahead, knowing that there could be a team that has to shut down for the season, which would not only impact them, but could impact the other teams that they were supposed to play. So there isn't going to be a minimum amount of games that you have to play if there was some sort of a playoff, which now looks less likely. So, I mean, I would say it's conceivable that a team could choose to start later than the first day, but they aren't going to be able to say, well, I don't care what the MPA says, we're going to have our cross-country meet earlier.
Right. They can choose to start later, but they can't start games any earlier. They will not count. So,
yeah. And that's the other thing. I mean, school districts can make that choice of which sports they're going to offer, regardless of what the MPA decides.
Well, that's it. Deer Isle Stonington will compete in golf and cross country, but not in soccer. So they've made that call already up there.
All right, here's another question, and we've sort of touched on this, but it's a little bit different take. With football being played currently in states like Alabama, as well as being planned to be played in neighboring New Hampshire, what are the panelists' thoughts on Maine not supporting
it? Steve, you want to take that?
Well, as I already said, I mean, I really do believe if football can and should be played anywhere, it would be in Maine. Now, do I think it should have been played in some of these states that when they made the decision were, totally red on the maps that you look at with COVID infection? no, I don't think they should be playing football in Alabama. You know, I mean, get the thing under control. Iowa, you know, they played baseball and softball in the summer, and they had like at least something like 45 teams that had to shut down because of COVID outbreaks. And now the state's even way worse than it was then. But they're playing football, right? So is that a good choice? Is that really the example that we want to use? Now, if you look at New Hampshire, which has very similar COVID infection rates, then I think you can make the argument that, you know, Maine should be given that opportunity to play as well. And I think that's the argument that coaches are saying over and over to me is we deserve the chance. And I think the MPA tried to give them that chance, you know, that we deserve the chance. And then if things happen, then if we see the, you know, if the blinking yellow light that Mike referenced earlier turns to red, at least we'll know we were given an opportunity, and that we can explain to our athletes a lot better than just we never tried.
I want to mention Alice Wag asked about Nordic skiing in the winter. That is considered a low-risk sport, Alice, and it should have the green light to go.
And the fact that they already use staggered starts is actually being seen as a potential model for how they could run cross country as well in the fall.
All right, it looks like we might have time for one more question, perhaps two from our audience. These are from the Q&As. How much do you think communities lose by not having high school sports?
Oh, it's immeasurable, I think, in terms of, well, I mean, you know, just getting together on a Saturday afternoon in a high school football game is just a great boost for a lot of the community members. It's high school sports provides a bond that the community goes, you know, rallies around, and to not have that, it is going to be difficult. It's you know, the schools are planning to live stream these events as much as possible. And that's fine, but it's not the same. You're sitting at home watching a game on a computer is not the same as sitting there in the stands and cheering your neighbor's kid on or your son on. There's a lot missing, and economically it's going to take a hit, because if you go to a game, there are people who come from other towns that come to your games. They're going to maybe spend money not only at your concession stand, but maybe they go out and have dinner in your town or anything. So there's an economic hit as well.
I think Mike summed it up. It'll be a real loss, like so many other things that have already taken place since the coronavirus pandemic started. You know, and maybe that's, you know, if you're making the argument for why sports need to be very different or some need to be canceled, that could be an argument you would make, is that this is not the only group that has had to suffer or make some significant adjustments because of this pandemic.
Agreed. So we're getting to the point where we are about ready to wrap up our show. And I would like to thank everyone who attended tonight. And again, I want to thank you so much for subscribing to the Portland Press Herald. I happen to feel that our newspaper has done an essential, highly important job during the pandemic in keeping people informed about what's going on, about the dangers out there, about the risks. And I believe the same has been true of Mike and Steve and the work that they've done in sports. They've done a fantastic job. So again, thank you very much for attending tonight. I do want to call to your attention yet another Zoom chat that we're going to have 2 weeks from now. That's on September 22nd. Actually, this sounds more like 3 weeks from now. That's going to be our next subscribers event. That one is going to involve our photojournalists, so you don't want to miss that one. They do a fantastic job with that. So again, thank you to all for attending tonight, and we hope to see you soon.